Welcome to the next Physios in Sport webinar. I'm delighted to welcome Matt Taberner with us today. So, as I said, we're delighted to have Matt with us today, who's got over 12 years experience working in the English Premier League. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about some of his research and some of his work in rehabilitation and return to play.
So thanks for Physios in Sport for the invitation to present today. Some of the background of my professional doctorate at Liverpool John Moores University. So the presentation's entitled Progressing Rehabilitation After Injury, Consider the Control Chaos Continuum. So Liam did a bit of a brief background of my academic and work experience. So I've worked in the Premier League environment for over 12 years. So I started off working at Aston Villa Football Club back in 2007, predominantly working with the academy. And when the EPPP came into fruition, I moved into the role of lead academy sports scientist and responsible for the sports science provision from obviously the 23s downwards through the academy. But my main role was predominantly with the senior 23s group, and then obviously working as well a little bit with the first team in special cases when required, making sure I was adaptable as a practitioner. I then moved to Everton Football Club in 2013, and you can see I was in a few roles. I occupied the role of assistant first team sports scientist for the first season I was there for around 8 months, and then I moved into the role of head of sports science in 2014. I was in that position for 3 seasons, working with 3 different managers. From 3 different nationalities, so you can imagine that was an amazing experience and a challenging one at that as well, but taught me a lot of things about how to interact and how to communicate in different environments and in different people. And then obviously in that role, and where I was assistant sports scientist, I did a lot of rehabilitation, as I have throughout my career, helping with the physiotherapy team. And then it moved into the role of head of rehabilitation in my last 2 seasons at Everton, where I left Everton in August 2019. And you'll see at the bottom, so I did my BSc at the University of Northampton in Sport and Exercise Science, my Master's degree at Loughborough University in Sports Nutrition. I then moved on a bit later back into academic research in 2018, started my Professional Doctorate at Liverpool John Moores University. With the title, obviously, of my thesis being Constructing a Framework for Return to Sport in Elite Football. And as part of that, being professional, I joined some of that alongside completing my BASIS High Performance Sport Accreditation, which I just recently achieved that a few weeks ago. So, yeah, that's a sort of a brief background into my history working in elite football. I'm going to go through my professional doctorate, but I think it's first of all important to understand how we frame the control chaos continuum and the importance of rehabilitation in an elite environment. So this is just a sort of a diagram, just as an overview of the demands really of professional football and the associated injuries. So you can see in the boxes in the top left the sort of the typical movement demands of elite football players and football at all levels really. So football players are required to run at speed, jump, pass, kick, tackle, turn, twist, change direction, make decisions. Make decisions when there's high levels of pressure, and obviously execute technical skills, which is obviously why these players are elite. They have a high level of technical execution and have a high level of decision making. Then you've got the physiological demands that are placed upon that. So you've got typically in elite level, there's a few studies on this. I think probably the most sort of cited one is the one by Barnes that was done on a few years ago on the Premier League demand, showing that the total distance is almost sort of stayed the same, and the high intensity actions and high intensity running demands have gone up. But typically players cover between 9 and 12 kilometers in a game, between 4 and 1,200 meters of high speed running. That's movement speed typically over 5.5 meters per second. Sprint demands between 1 and 400 meters. That's 7 meters a second above. And position and acceleration decelerations within the values of 200 to 300. Obviously, there is some issues regarding the reliability and validity of acceleration deceleration demands, depending on what technology is used to sample that, whether that be optical or GPS, GNS. And obviously with those demands, there's high variability between positions and also huge inter-variability between players within certain positions as well. So you get fullbacks, for example, will have different outcomes depending upon the technical and tactical requirements of the coach and the game model that is the game model utilised by the coach. And obviously you see the box on the right-hand side. You've got the demands of this. So players have a 6-week pre-season, a 9-month season, and then within that 9-month season, if it's teams at the highest level, teams can vary between 1 to 3 games a week. And then you've got this sort of the period over Christmas where it can be really congested. TV schedules obviously make commitments, and the demands of those are placed on teams where they're just really in a cycle of playing, recovery. And obviously your game load dictates over your training load, which obviously gives you an example of what the player's concurrent load will be. So these physical demands and these fixture demands obviously result in injury when we don't know the reason for injury. It could be with fatigue related, it could be strength related, it could be so many different risk factors for injury. But typically I've classified in these into 3 different areas really. So you'll see that are highlighted by the different colours. So muscular injuries, typically the hamstring strain injury is the most prevalent in professional football. Then you've got those that obviously quad injuries, groin injuries, calf injuries, which seem to be becoming more apparent, those are the gastroc and soleus more recently. You obviously have knee injuries, of which the ACL is probably the most severe of all, and obviously puts a large burden upon the sports performance and medical team. And then you have highlighted in red, obviously, stress and traumatic fractures. The stress fractures might come from obviously different things, biomechanics of players, overload for a period of time, or you obviously get traumatic fractures that result from obviously events that we cannot control. So mistimed kicks and tackles. So obviously you can see there's risk factors associated with injuries and the physiological demands. So injury occurs. So that's why if injury occurs, it's important that we have good rehabilitation practices in place to help get these players back as quick and as safely as possible. Also, re-injury is a problem. So when you look over the literature, it seems to suggest that between 15 and 33% of injuries result in re-injury. And the risk factors associated with that are potentially inadequate healing, which is related to premature return to sport. So the player is not ready to go back because the tissue hasn't adequately healed, which results in re-injury. And secondly, inadequate rehabilitation, which is sort of the area that I'm sort of looking to address. So it's important that clubs have effective return to sport processes in place to help get players back as safely and effectively as they can. Because ultimately, when we look at it, if it's a key player, it's important to the team to have that key player available, because key players means that we have it's not affecting the manager's game model, that he's the best team he wants to play, which ultimately results in greater chance of winning games. That results in more points, which obviously move the team at the table and obviously has greater financial income for the team. Consequently, there might be risk factors that are associated in that, between bringing players back maybe slightly earlier, but that's a balance of risk and reward and the risk of benefit of making judgments in rehab and progressing players more rapidly. And these are things that are all around the context of the particular situation. So to shape that, it's important that we look at, obviously, the research in this area. So in terms of the return to sport, the first actual statement came out in 2002, before the one that's highlighted on the screen, by a number of associations in America, from American College of Sports Medicine for one. So it highlighted the importance of obviously reconditioning the injured body part, returning the player back to a level of function to return to sport. But there was one thing that it didn't look at was actually that the final return to sport decision was that of the team decision. So there was no sort of shared decision making in that sort of initial return to sport decision making statement. And then there was a really more in-depth statement that came out in 2016, and the lead author, Claire Arden, who's done some excellent work, and she sort of highlighted this sort of return to sport continuum, as you'll see on the right. So it's an amalgamation of the recovery and rehabilitation of the athlete. So the first phase is the return to participation phase, where the athlete is actively participating in rehabilitation, but is not at the level to return to sport. We have the return to sport phase, where the player is obviously returning to sport, which may be joining in with training, starting to go through a progressive period of match minutes and returning to competition. But then we have the return to performance phase at the end, which is the ultimate goal for any athlete returning to sport, returning to at least or above their previous level of performance. And what's interesting enough around this, it's obviously hopefully going to drive better research in areas. And in that final phase, that return to performance, currently there's a lot of there's limited research knowing what a return to performance is, which hopefully we will start to address in the coming years. I think that's quite a broad sort of continuum, and I think it's important for framing where your sort of rehabilitation sits and where the athlete is in terms of communication with the shared decision-making team. Where's the athlete at? What's he doing? But then I think Matthew Buckthorpe highlighted something that was really important, that that was so broad. Now we need to say this is separated into different phases, and it's that clinical overlap between the clinical rehabilitation, as in the treatment, the early management of the player, and then obviously returning that player to on-pitch action. So Matt separated into OFR, which is on-field rehabilitation, return to training, return to competition, and then leading to a return to performance. So it's quite complicated. And I think Matt highlighted another key point within this is obviously who is the rehabilitation practitioner? I mean, for me, it's someone who has the skills, the experience, not just to return the athlete to a level of function, but to return that athlete to the demands of high-level sport. I think that's really important. It's who has the skills within the sports performance and medical team to do what part of the process that they communicate between, and obviously there's good crossover to get that player back to action as quickly and as safely as we can. So I think, Alan McCall's excellent editorial really around the topic of sort of risk assessment, and I think there's a lot of work to come out in this area now, how we make decisions in elite practice. It's all about balancing risk and reward, or risk benefit. So I talk about risk benefit as in the practitioner doing something during rehabilitation, and then risk and reward of making that return to sport decision. When do we feel it's safe and necessary for the player return to sport? And it's all about balancing the risk of re-injury and the risk tolerance in the athlete. And I think Shear's tiered shared decision-making model is an excellent way of incorporating some of the elements that we collect and the levels of objective we collect in a sports performance environment. Paul Dexter highlighted obviously the importance of the shared decision-making process, and I think this is really important at the high level. Communication, I think there was a great study that highlighted the importance of communication in decision-making in an elite environment, and I can't emphasize how important that is, that allowing people with the expertise in their area to comment in the areas and add what they can to this shared decision-making process, because ultimately it's about obviously helping the player get back as quickly and safely as he can. I think Johnny King of Bournemouth made an excellent point of obviously being player-centered as well. The player needs to be involved. There was excellent communication as well. I think Jermaine Defoe highlighted that the elite player knows when he knows his body, he knows when he's ready, and the last thing that the elite player wants to do is go back when he's been out for a long period of time and get re-injured. But I think when we refer back to that Shear's decision-making model, I think there was something that was missing from that was actually that obviously the amount of training, sport-specific training that the athlete has performed prior to return to sport. And I think although some of the concepts around the acute chronic workload ratio have potentially been shown to be flawed recently, I think what Tim does make is some excellent concepts around obviously the amount of training performed in rehab. And I think sometimes some of the simple descriptive measures can help to inform rehab more effectively than a one number ratio to tell us all. But importantly, I think Jordan Stairs highlighted something about the importance of training in rehab. And there was a study from AFL showing that if we extend a player's rehab and increase their training load or their capacity as such, that it protects it against subsequent injury risk in rehabilitation. So some really important points there around return to sport, not just in elite football, but any sport. So what did I do? And obviously the importance of my environment when I started my professional doctorate was trying to conceptualize some of the work I'd been doing for a number of years. So around the control chaos continuum, which I first actually presented at the Stat Sports Conference in 2014. But was really about how can I sort of importantly get this across to people to able one to improve obviously scientific knowledge in the return to sport process, because when I looked at the contemporary literature, it was very sparse in this area. Actually, what do you do on the pitch with the player? And secondly, it was important that I needed to get this across. So I had to look through different areas of research. So knowledge translation and something called conceptual framework analysis. So the theoretical framework, as in one theory, was not something that was going to fit what I wanted to do, because when I looked at all the different things that I was planning and going through in terms of the planning and monitoring process of obviously the injured player, it's a lot of interrelated concepts. So importantly, the conceptual framework was one that was going to work for me. So I went through this conceptual framework analysis that you can see I'll briefly go over as sort of 8 phases. So what considerations? That's obviously my knowledge of working in an environment for a period of time and conducting this with elite athletes, having understanding of potentially what works and what doesn't work and the process involved. Now, obviously, as well with my background, having an understanding of the training and monitoring process in fit and healthy players. Because if we look at this concept of ecological validity that I've mentioned in a recent BDSM blog, that is what we're preparing the players to. So we have to understand the demands and the environment that the fit and healthy players, that player's going to have when he returns. So I went through a literature review, which was quite extensive and was quite challenging. And the key was around then naming, categorizing, integrating these concepts and synthesizing them to enable me to translate that knowledge to other practitioners around the world. And then the challenging thing in my environment was obviously trying to validate that framework, and obviously knowing that it's quite negligent to treat every single player and every single injury exactly the same way, because every player is different, every injury is different. So the key part around my control chaos continuum was the adaptability of it. And the key was being able to adapt that framework to a particular player and a particular injury and around the situation and the context of that injury. So the best way I've seen to do this was a series of case reports, a case series, as you may call it. So I think went through in terms of what injuries would I get. So what I did for my doctorate was I did 3 injuries. I did a common injury, hamstring strain injury, as we all know, a rare injury, a tibia-fibula fracture, and the last one that obviously hasn't been published as such yet is an ACL reconstruction in an elite female athlete. And again, finally, phase 8, which is important for me, was the review part. So because it's a conceptual framework, it allows you to review and adapt this as technology and as knowledge improves over time. So hopefully in the coming years, as things evolve and as things improve, the concepts underpin the control chaos continuum can be adapted. It's important for me for my lit review. What did I go through? So this is published in my doctoral thesis that I hopefully will be able to share with everyone soon. So importantly, there's a number of concepts that underpin the control chaos continuum. So these are obviously energy system conditioning. These are highlighted by asterisks, sorry. Quantification of load, periodization and load management, sport-specific skills, and the shadowing overview of not just the quantitative aspect of load, but the qualitative aspects of load in competition. But importantly, before we even get to the on-pitch activity and the return to running, there's crucial things that obviously help support that. So we have strength and power diagnostics that help us inform us with objective information to when we're going to return that player to running and how we're going to progress rehabilitation alongside the player being pain-free, have a lack of joint effusion if it's a joint injury, and also how the player feels, communicating with the player. And we also have the concept that was termed by Phil Glasgow, sort of optimal loading. So we get an injury, obviously, that typically goes through the price, but now we've got this police that Chris Bleakley has mentioned about optimal loading. So how can we maximize the physiological adaptation of the injured structures and tissues? And that's important. That's different types of loading that we apply to different tissues. Also, we need to think about the mechanisms and demands that are placed on those tissues within sporting competition and the demands that we want to get them back to. So it's obviously understanding that. And these important things that underpin the framework, because if the player hasn't gone through this strength and conditioning and optimal loading process prior to on-pitch rehabilitation, there's also potentially a risk of re-injury when the player actually gets to on-pitch. Obviously, the strength and power diagnostics can actually inform the process of your loading in the gym-based rehabilitation. I'll briefly go over a few of these topics. So quantification of load. So the monitoring process in the healthy, fit athlete, and typically in elite football now, is used by GPS and more now GNS. And there is some obviously questionability around some of the reliability and validity of certain metrics that are taken from GPS systems. But there is some important information out there in terms of studies that have shown that running load metrics typically total distance, high-speed running, for example, are reliable and valid measures of the running load in athletes. But four important things to maybe highlight from a sports scientist perspective, that from a physio standpoint, that aren't typically looked at, the quality of the data that you use from GPS. So typically when we look at the quality of data, the GPS, we'll look at two things. So we'll look at the number of satellites that the system is connected to. Typically we'll take this as a number of satellites over 6 is accepted as a good standard. And obviously you can get that from your global positioning systems. Secondary, it's the HDOP, the horizontal dilution of precision. When we say that, obviously in the military, a military standard would be the score of 1. So anything really way above that is obviously not a great measure. So they're important considerations. And then also say the importance of obviously checking your activity profile for irregularities, say for a peak speed, for example. It's important to check that prior to obviously reporting data, because that's going to relate to the quality of the data we're reporting. And this was something I took from a paper by Franco and Petzilio, is the value of multiple metrics. So in the environment we're working, in the sporting room we're working, what metrics will we take that are going to tell us about the demands, the running load demands placed upon the athlete within their sport? So when you're obviously going to report your rehabilitation report for a player, understand the demands placed on the player and pick metrics that are associated with the demands that are going to be placed on the player in competition and in rehab. And obviously the improvement in real-time technology has obviously been a big breakthrough for rehabilitation to allow us to make adjustments where required if we need to, real time. And there's a study there that just showing that the validity between download to real-time GPS metrics. So importantly, when you look at this, so looking at how global positioning data is used in the fit and healthy player and how it can be used for rehab. So we can use it for player profiling. So from a perspective of movement profile, technical traits, heat map data, threshold data, which is the training and the match data, which you might take as typical measures of dispersion, so max, mean, and variation. And obviously it's important to understand that threshold data in terms of the training and match can come from different sources. So in the Premier League, we use optical data for match technology. So it's important to understand the relationships between optical data and GPS systems, rather than taking this is the match load of the player when there's maybe no association between the match and the training data. So it's important for my suggestion to conduct your own in-house research to look at the relationships between training and match data to make sure they're consistent. And then there's this concept of maximal intensity period, or worst case scenario it's called, and that may be derived from either intensity of running load or the density. The training data is then used in terms of obviously planning, implementing, monitoring and adjusting, and it's that ongoing cycle of communication with the environment. And then that data that you're collecting on the fit and healthy player, when that player gets injured, it can serve a vital backbone of your rehabilitation plan throughout the control chaos continuum. But I think for me, it's important to understand we're not just looking at running load. We're not just looking at numbers. We need to think about the context of actual movement in competition. So this shows a central midfield player. You obviously see its subtle movements. I'll play it back again. As you'll see in the heat map, moving side to side, looking to receive the ball, looking to just distribute the ball, looking to break through the lines of play to obviously penetrate the opposition. And you'll see this, it's subtle movement. This is the running load demand in competition. It's not constant running in straight lines. It's subtle movements. It's moving with his own teammates, with the opposition, through the game phases. So it's important to recognize this. And this is where video analysis data can be a real important aspect for the rehabilitation practice. The consideration of the demands actually placed on the athlete in competition, but also considering the technical and tactical demands placed on that player. How can we start to embed them in our rehabilitation earlier so that it fits in with the coach's game model? But obviously we need to ensure that the training prescribed is also in the presence of injury. So there is a potential risk of re-injury if we're too progressive. Hence why the objectives that we collect help us inform our decision making. But that really what shows is that movement in sport and competition is spontaneous, anticipated, reactive, and variability. And I think the unpredictability of sport and competition is why we all love sport. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't foresee the worst team in the league could beat the best team in the league. And these are things that make sport so wonderful. But I think considering that concept of ecological validity and representative design, it's important that we start to incorporate these movements and these actions in a rehabilitation when it is safe to do so. So as I say, that rehabilitation should move on a continuum from generalized training to specific training and incorporating some of these concepts. And then we have to look at the planning process in the fit and healthy player. Pardon me. So we have to look at these competition microcycles. Typically, what can go on in a Premier League week, depending on who the manager is, if you won the previous weekend, what's the plan for the team? So what is the plan we have to get our injured player back to? What are the demands of within that week that he's going to face? Knowing that if this is an injured player and he's returning in the congested fixture period, then maybe changes in the returning player's load that we may have to supplement with additional work. So we just need to think about what are we returning the player back to? What is the level and what is the intra-week demands? So it just depends. So typically looking at a sort of a tactical periodization paradigm, typically in a football environment, you have acquisition period, which is separated into intensive and extensive football, which obviously also incorporates the technical and tactical demands of the coach. And then we taper into match day, go into game. But when you look in a rehabilitating player, it's different. We're not preparing for competition with an injured player. We're preparing to get the player back to training as quickly and as safely as we can. So this is obviously something that I had to play around with doing, and obviously in my experience and background, how did I plan the returning player? So we have the two sort of periodization paradigms that were taken from the tactical periodization paradigm. Is the first phases, which are the high control to moderate control, which is the return to running phases. So obviously the player, if he's just returning to running, he's not going to go into an extensive demand, football demand straight away. Is he comfortable returning to running? So we go into this generalized training. Is he comfortable at returning to running? He's pain free, he's confident, he's achieving the running load demands that you set aligned to the plan. And then obviously the second phase would obviously control change direction load and a gradual progression in linear running load speed demands. So lower threshold high speed running below 7 meters per second, or catered to the percentage of the maximal speed, depending if you need to change it. And as we go through this process, we're building confidence with the player. We're building a foundation of the chronic load targets we're looking to hit. If that's required, we must consider the chronic load demand might not be an important element in the decision-making process if it's a short-term injury. If it's a short-term injury, the player will progress through these phases very quickly and obviously may not go through every phase. That's the whole point of the adaptability of this framework. It can be adapted to fit the needs of the injury in a specific case. So if it's a chronic load, it's a long-term injury, we move to the football-specific phases, and obviously then we look to readily try to achieve the chronic load demands of the athlete before they return to competition, because we're trying to improve the capacity of the athlete. The best way of doing this is manipulating the intensive and extensive demand. So intensive is within restricted small space areas. So you're looking at explosive movements, short spaces, acceleration, deceleration activities, obviously interlinking the technical and tactical demands. Extensive, we open the areas up. So obviously we're looking at expansive, high-speed running and sprint demands relative to that player and the demands of the player related to his position. So, for example, if it's a centre-back, we know that he's probably not going to go over maybe 100 to 150 metres of sprint in the game. So is there a real good benefit of going to 300 and 400 metres of sprint distance in a session for that player, or is that undue risk that we're adding in a high elite environment? So then we go through this phase. So it's that going from that generalised to specific again. So to get these required demands, we look at Newell's constraints model. So we have constraints that we apply upon the athlete. So we have the athlete, obviously we cater the environment to the athlete as we move further down the level of specificity. So for example, if it's a fullback, for example, we'll start to structure the areas on the pitch where that athlete will play. And then we cater that, we manipulate the running load demands and the technical and tactical level of demand we want by placing certain task and environmental constraints on that player to shape the learning or the rehabilitation environment to the level of control that we're looking to achieve. And we go through this process, and then as we get to this higher level of specificity, we then start to look at the coach's game model. Can we implement elements of what the coach would want to implement with that player? So this would relate to the physical capabilities of the player, So, for example, if it's a fullback, for example, we know that the fullbacks have high speed running and sprint demands. So we know that we're looking to train certain types of physical qualities that are associated with those running load demands. We have a look at the positional application of game movements. So that's where we would plug into the performance analysis team to get video content of how and where this player moves in relation to obviously attacking phases, defensive phases, and the transition between these phases. We also get ideas and implementation from the coaching team if the coaching team, depending on what their stance is around return to play after sport. And then the periodization structure will progressively move to the demands of what we're looking to place upon that player when they return into competition and training. And then on a micro level, this is something hopefully we share with you soon, is obviously the planning on a daily basis. What does that look like? So what are we looking to achieve in terms of our running load upper lower limits? What are the running load demands look within particular drills? It's having a plan that we can communicate with the medical and performance team of what the player is going to do, so we all share and know where the player is at. What are the physical qualities we're looking to train? How are we going to achieve them? What is the underpinning physiology we're looking to place upon the player? And what are the technical and tactical level elements we're looking to address within that session? Again, communication is important. So what do these phases look like? So we're moving along that continuum from generalized training to specific training. So the first phase is obviously high control. It's a return to linear running at sub-maximal intensities, as in building confidence in the player that they can run and they can tolerate the musculoskeletal mechanical demands of running at the associated speed. And again, this is just showing a box-to-box run, 16 seconds with a 14-second active walk to the edge of the penalty area and back, give you a 30-second window. Repeat a set number of repetitions of this, which will start to build your foundation for to a low level of aerobic conditioning. We then move into the second phase, which is obviously, again, starting to incorporate change direction activities, incorporating the ball, because obviously we know we can get increased stimulation from in terms of an internal response on the player by incorporating the ball. By incorporating the ball, we also incorporate the motivation of the athlete to be involved in the session, and the athlete can see progress from phase 1 into phase 2 as they actually feel like they're becoming a football now. They're not just a running athlete. So obviously this can be catered to the demands of the player and obviously the technical demands that they're looking to face. So obviously you can incorporate some low level passing that could be to a rebound board or with another coach. You can also incorporate, it's open to what you feel like you need to incorporate to that player, but the whole stance is control by changing the task and environmental constraints constrained upon that player. And then we move into the control to chaos phases and the additive chaos. So uncontrollable movements, which are progressively tiered in and layered. And it's important to highlight here in these 3 videos, these are only elements of sessional content. As we refer back to the previous slide, these are only small parts. So we start to now incorporate what the player would be faced upon a typical training session within a typical training week if he was a fit and healthy player. So the control chaos video shows a positional. So there's a positional acceleration drill for a centre half. So it's the pace of the ball, obviously the pass from myself will dictate the speed. Obviously the player will accelerate at, and obviously the speed that the player accelerates at will determine the player's braking or deceleration action. And obviously what we know that acceleration and deceleration are important qualities to train in a football player. And obviously incorporate, so it's a rapid acceleration, turn, face out, and play the ball out from the back. Short acceleration actions. So it's just a snapshot of positional acceleration drills that you can incorporate. Then obviously as we move into sort of the moderate and high chaos phases, we start to hit the high intensity speed demands, but it's obviously dependent upon the type of injury. So this is a player who came back from surgical hamstring reattachment, and obviously placing chaotic high speed running demands positionally for that player was obviously a higher risk sort of situation. But importantly, that was backed up with obviously the objectives that were collective and the communication with the physio and the medical team. And obviously, so it's a repeatability, so this would be a speed production drill. So it's a high intensity effort repeated for a short bout of time and then adequate respiratory period before a repeatability effort. And this is obviously tailored to the running load demand that was tailored to the particular phase. And then we moved into high chaos, which could be associated, if required, to worst case scenario sort of drill moment. So this is just a reincarnation of a player that got injured in a Premier League game, moving on to a through ball from a fullback, breaking the lines through the centre circle to move on to the ball into the opposition's field of play. And obviously shows that curved high-speed running action onto a field of play. So it was about not just achieving the running load demands, but trying to achieve it in a context that was obviously giving the player confidence he was ready to return in the same context of how he got injured. Obviously, sometimes you can't wait for certain factors depending upon stage of game, which might be influenced by fatigue. But this player got injured early in the game. But it's obviously replicating those movements and obviously trying to incorporate that into your rehabilitation plan. So it gives you an idea of what sort of the phases look like within the continuum. And then we have that concept, which is important, which hopefully that further research will start to look at in long-term injuries, is returning that player back to the required loads. And I say required loads because it depends. It depends on the situation that you're trying to get the player back into. Is it the mean load that you take for a number of training weeks? Is it the max week you take? It all depends on the situation. So here we've got concurrent chronic mean load and training chronic mean load. Will be somewhere in the next few months, hopefully I'll say some stuff around preparing the player for certain types of max load within the week, especially where if it's a long-term injury, the manager can change, the coaching style can change, and so can the training load demands. So these are also important things to consider when you're returning a player back. Think about the situation and the context of the injury and the player. So then what do we do? So the application of the framework, so the validation as such, if you want to call it. So the first one obviously was a player who come back from intramuscular hamstring tendon tear. And the important for me is with any rehab, have conceptual goals for your rehab. What are you looking to achieve and why are you trying to achieve it? And how does it get player back to a level of running load and ready to return to sport? So with this player, importantly, it was mechanically loading the muscle tendon unit to improve tensile strength, obviously high eccentric strength, putting through that injured structure, and elastic stiffness, so resistance to deformity. So obviously you've got that importance between high-speed running demand and elastic stiffness. And then importantly then, progressive return to chronic load, going through that process of control to chaos. And for hamstring strain injuries, when you look at the literature, including positional specific conditioning, high-speed running and maximal speed exposure, making sure the player is ready to return. And obviously, the objective measures that we use with the IPC test, and then at the end, the eccentric knee flexion test to make sure that we brought sure that player was ready to go back. So it was a collected number of pieces of objective information that helped to inform that return to sport decision. The second application published in BFJ Open was that of a rare injury. So obviously, again, different type of injury to the bone. So what do we need to look at? We need to look at, when we looked at the bones, important concepts are optimal loading, but also novel loading. Bones adapt to a certain stimulus, which obviously is important, but then they sort of don't get another response until you progress again, which is that concept of novel loading. So novel loader will increase stimulation to upregulate osteocyte production. And obviously, importantly for bone, restoring mechanical rigidity. So being progressive and also site-specific stimuli. And I think there was an important study by Stuart Warden in America, which came from baseball pitches actually, where it looked at the pitching arm and the non-pitching arm, and it showed the pitching arm had a much greater bone mineral density than the non-pitching arm. So this is important about site-specific loading, bone injury. Can we put load into the specific injury site? When you think of it, obviously the action of how he got injured, it was a mistimed tackle. And obviously you think importance of getting this player and building confidence through static block tackling into tackling with movement and then tackling in context, going through that progression and get site-specific loading stimuli to the injury site. And again, going through that progressive return to chronic load, control chaos, increasing the running load volume, which importantly what we did was we progressed the running load for 2 weeks, a 1 week deload before the return to chronic load was achieved. Because also when you increase the running speed demand, you increase the tibial strain placed upon the athlete. And again, incorporating the technical actions that were important to this player and obviously his demands of his sport. And then moving on to the final case, just to build around it. So obviously you know that it's not just important to focus upon the incidence of injury. So we know obviously hamstring strain injuries are the most common And obviously you've got other ones in there that are common as groin muscle injuries, etc. And obviously contusions, contact sort of injuries. But then if you look at the top, you've got the ACL injury tear, which is obviously probably the most severe of injuries to a football player, and that probably prevents a high burden upon the sports performance and medical team. And then we look at the literatures around there, return to sport criteria, which obviously time's important, strength, hop testing, which I think evidence now coming out to show that the use of hop testing is pretty much quite flawed, because it gives you a score, but it doesn't tell you how that score is achieved. And we look at some of the research from sort of Sigwand, shows that players can develop these sort of learned responses of how they load. So example, ACL athletes will offload the knee and load the hip. So obviously hop testing, they will develop a hip dominant strategy for loading. Obviously when we want to ensure that the player is ready to go back up. So we obviously can create a sort of risk of overloading the uninjured limb, and obviously why we potentially see a huge incidence in injury to the contralateral ACL when a player returns. And then you've got this performance-based criteria, which I don't really know what it means. It just says performance criteria. So I think we need to highlight, us as practitioners and researchers, what is performance-based criteria? And importantly, I think the Grindheim study is important, that obviously simple decision rules. I mean, it shows that graft maturation is important. Graft maturation is around 9 months. And I think the study shows for every month you leave it off there, there's a substantial reduction in re-injury risk. But it sure also shapes the importance of ACL rehabilitation. Where does this fit? So we know obviously that they're not just structural injuries, they're considered neurophysiological injuries. Great research coming out from Dustin Grooms from the University of Ohio, showing that the brain is much more active after ACL injury than before. So obviously to consider, we don't just look at the player as in, we get the player back to a level of sport return, okay, he's in, we leave him alone. We need to monitor this player. We need to get them back to their previous level of performance. And research from Hewitt's group can show this could take up to 2 years after ACL injury. But we know that in the real life demands of elite sport, we can't stop a player from returning to training for 2 years. It's just unrealistic. So how can we sort of return that player to a level of return to sport and then return to performance? What do we need to look at? These are things I've sort of tried to highlight. So return to performance, typical match outputs. Is the player capable of producing what they did prior to injury or above? Handling concurrent loads. Can they handle the loads that are placed on them prior to injury or maybe higher? Is the knee able to cope? As in, is it pain-free? Is it free of effusion? The strength and power diagnostics changing? Are they developing issues, say, strategies? Do they display pre-injury traits? Are they doing the same sort of movements in competition that they did prior to injury? And this is important. Can we use video data to highlight this? And then you've got this player and coach confidence. This is crucial. And I think the player and the coach have a big part into play in the return to performance assessment. So does the player feel confident that they're at their level of previous level of performance? What is performance to a player? And then in a coach, I mean, a big one for a coach, for a sports science medical team, is the coach picking the player to play once they've returned? That's telling you the coach has confidence in that player, that they feel they're at the previous level of performance. But hopefully, research in the future will help to sort of classify what a true return to performance looks like. What we tried to do to address this was obviously help and guide that sort of return to sport, return to performance phase with the adjunct for ACL injuries. So the return to performance pathway that was published earlier this year in the Aspetar Sports Medicine Journal. So it goes through that sort of return to train concept of non-contact, contact modification and full integration. We then have a progressive exposure to match minutes, which obviously this is all going through shared decision making, and then return to performance. And obviously the time spent within these phases will be dictated by where the injury is at, the communication between the staff and the player, and obviously objectives that are collected. It may take up to 2 years to return to performance. We just don't know enough about this type of injury yet to say that an athlete has returned to performance. So what does it look? Then we adapted again the tactical periodization paradigm to look at how that looks in those phases: return to training, then return to competition, return to performance. So you're looking to actually get that player back to the typical sort of training regime of the coach. And we might be able to sort of modify certain phases, as in the player might be a spare man, might be a floater, might be an outside man within small-sided games or an extensive games. And if you read the publication, there'll be more detailed, in-depth analysis of how potentially this may be framed and used. So then we have this sort of framework that can overlap and be used. So we have the control chaos continuum, is really like rehabilitation. So it's in that return to participation phase, getting the player ready to return to a level of a sport. And then in severe injuries, we have this return to performance pathway, where we can not just monitor the player through return to sport, through to a return to performance, to guide the player through that process. So just to summarize, so we have the return to sport continuum, which is important to frame where our rehabilitation is at. Is the player return to participation, actively involved in rehabilitation? Are they to a level to return to sport, back into team training? Or are they going towards the ultimate goal of any return to sport process is return to performance? So importantly, we have optimal loading that supports the progressive loading approach to get a player back to return to running. And then we go through this generalized to specific training, and obviously returning the athlete to pre-injury chronic loads where required. So we use the top control chaos continuum, the adaptable framework that we can change for the player and the type of injury. And then we have specific cases where the return to performance pathway can help guide that process past the return to sport. But importantly for me, I think over my experience, that clinical reasoning of why you do something in rehabilitation that's informed with some objective data, not just one piece of information in isolation. And we're happy that the data we're collecting is valid and reliable. And then that shared decision-making process. So we're communicating with all members and stakeholders of the team who have the knowledge in their specialist field and areas. So we can help, ultimately, we share the same goal of returning the player back as safely as safe and as healthy as we can possible. So obviously they can contribute to the team's success in the future. Thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Matt. Really enjoyed that. And congratulations on all the work that you've put into your doctorate. And people can obviously, there's a lot of the articles there that people can go away and have a little read of to find more about that, which is great. So some questions. So we'll have some people on this call with a range of experience and sports that they'll be working in, and we're starting to see now that sports are coming back into training, and though I suppose it's a bit of advice around those that have been on long-term rehabs during the lockdown with little external stimulus, whether that's from peers, external loads, from teammates, decision making, etc. And what sort of thoughts do you have or advice around those long-term rehabs that are going to be coming back into this new environment?
I think first of all, it's a very challenging situation because no one would have faced this situation before. I think that's the first thing to say. I think in this challenging situation, hopefully, practitioners share how we learn. That's the first thing to say. I will say a running load mechanical perspective, and then as we know, they've pretty much been on their own in isolation. So if they have been running, have we collected any information? I know some clubs have sent, but we know then that running will just typically be running, which is again that away from the demands of what football and sporting competition is. So I think it's just, first of all, collating all the information that's there that we can collect around that player's rehabilitation situation, considering the content, and then what is the conceptual goal based on the information of where we want to get to. What is the process we have to go? Just because players have this extended period of time for healing doesn't mean the player's ready to return to training. So I think it's about if the player is gone through rehab, maybe just go through less time within certain phases to get them to a level that we feel confident to progress them. Mm-hmm. So if they haven't, like you said, certain things that they wouldn't have had to make, decision making, technical and tactical things, that's going from control to chaos. Where we go through return to linear running, maybe 1 or 2 sessions, moderate control, some change direction work, whatever it may be, some low-level technical and tactical work. And then we start to make progress from the control to chaos and reincorporate in those other aspects, the qualitative aspects of movement in competition.
Brilliant, thank you. And regarding this period of lockdown, there's obviously been a huge change in an underloading of the athletes. And in terms of that load and change, are there any things that you think are probably going to be most threatening when they come back, or people are going to be most underloaded on, whether that's decision making, plyometrics, change direction, from your experience?
Yeah. Well, the problem with football is, as a sport itself, there's so many factors that influence football performance. So to put your one aspect is very hard to do, in my opinion. I would say, I would think the biggest thing would be obviously the things that we probably can't really objectively monitor. That is the sort of the striking actions as such, because we know that they can be very disastrous. If you get a sort of a grade 2C or 3C, it can be quickly disastrous. And it doesn't matter if you've gone for a perfect low progression that you think is there on paper, the player could still get injured. So it's considering the things that you maybe wouldn't consider as important in some situations. I also think it's important to consider, take away the sort of the rehab context here and just think about what the control chaos continuum is, sort of control to chaotic motions. As every player's been out for a long period of time, even the healthy players, surely their training needs to go through this process of moving controlled to chaotic motions, because they've all been absent from this, not just the unhealthy player, every player. So I think that the transferability of some elements of the continuum are a big transfer, not over to the healthy athlete as well.
Brilliant, thank you. A question around somebody that's working in a sport that doesn't have GPSs. Anything you'd recommend for trying to quantify load without that technology?
I mean, some of what we would always use, obviously, RPE data. So we would calculate sessional RPE by times in the RPE by the session duration, which can give you an indicator of the training load. And there is, I think maybe that's probably the most effective tool where you haven't got access to GPS technology. Some circumstances where you find when a player's been out for a long period of time, they come back in, they start to report high RPEs, even though the duration might be low, but they still have quite high RPEs because they've been out for a long period of time. So anything is quite stressful for the player level. As they start to adapt to that stress, and obviously centrally, we know the cardiovascular players can adapt quite quickly, given obviously that they're trained athletes. They sometimes then start to report. So really, it's hard to sometimes distinguish between what's perceptually hard, if that makes sense. So that's the challenge. I think the important thing is to be the one who communicates and gets the RPE from the player if you're the one working with someone else, because the player has to value that the RPE is being used for a reason. And that's important. And obviously then with RPE, you can look at things like monotony and strain as well, for example, which can tell you more than just obviously the sessional RPE clue its own in isolation.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier in your talk about the acute chronics. Would you use the acute chronics on your RPEs? Do you find that useful?
I mean, acute chronic workload, I'll be honest, it's never something I've ever used. I've always been very skeptical of up my reason to doing something, as well as obviously your experience as a practitioner.
Perfect. And going through that return to play continuum, the control chaos continuum, how much involvement would you typically get the coaches in with that? Would they be a key stakeholder in that?
Over my experience of working with quite a few different coaches of different nationalities, I mean, I've just written something that I'll share with people soon in the next few weeks around coaching stances on return to sport and rehabilitation, around sometimes that the highest level of chaos can be player and team interaction. So it depends upon the coaching staff's stance on return to sport and decision making, that whether you can progress them into sort of partial and team interaction quicker. So it's my stance on, if you have good communication with your team and they can see that they want to return play, they can do partial interaction, maybe part of a warm-up even one session before they come out. You can actually get them involved with the players earlier. But it's obviously all situational, depending how long the player's out, what are the potential weights you have for re-injury risk and risk tolerance for that individual athlete. But I would say where you can, when you get to that level of specificity and you can start to incorporate the coach around some of the drill design and elements, that's really important, because that's what they're going to go in and do when they're fit and healthy.
And you've worked with a number of coaches there, and I think what would be interesting is, have you ever had any like challenges or backlash to your framework? Because obviously a lot of coaches sometimes
sometimes when they're in the earlier stages, the coaches, obviously they see them as an injured athlete, although they communicate with them off the pitch, they don't really, they've got the other fit, healthy players, 25 players to deal with. So when they're fit and available, they're not a huge concern, even though they're communicating with off the pitch to see, how's your rehab going, et cetera, et cetera. There's still that level of communication, which obviously keeps the injured player healthy and mentally, as in they're still in the manager's thoughts, et cetera. You know, managers and coaches come over and watch part of the session at the end stage to see where they're at, just to sort of gauge where they feel the player is at. But then you get other coaches that are like, unless the player's 100% ready, then he's not joining. So there's no partial interaction or anything. So it's two ends of the scale. It just depends on the different coaches' sort of football culture and background and where they go.
Perfect. We've got a question here about your, you mentioned around the monitoring of players, and that's where you've taken a lot of your approach from the monitoring of the healthy player. Yeah. Now, we've got some people that obviously have less equipment than you necessarily would have in a Premier League football team, but if you were to strip back your monitoring, your testing as a pre and post injury or during your rehab, what would be your essential, I want to look at, if we say, for example, looked at a hamstring injury, common injury that a lot of us would come across, are there any little equipment or?
I suppose obviously from an external running load perspective, that the GPS is going to tell you probably more about what they're doing on pitch than anything else at the moment, unless you maybe got video data. I mean, GPS wasn't in football. We used Polar Team 1 heart rate monitoring systems that sort of buzzed in the office all the time, and like the time we want the athlete to achieve that distance in, we can sort of calculate roughly what the running speed peak they will achieve, given the cost of these acceleration, deceleration at the end of a linear run. So if we know that roughly, we could calculate approximately what running load demand we were placing on the athlete in given straight line circumstances. When that goes into football, that's like a whole different ball game. You can't substantiate for that. So I would suggest, like, for me, I suppose GPS is telling me more about my training prescription, and the internal response with the heart rate monitor is telling me a lot about the global load I'm placing on the athlete. Subjective RPE was collected as a freebie, I guess, because it doesn't cost anything. And I suppose for me, probably what's improved for me more than for making my decision is the use of force platform technology, sort of 4 years really. Mm-hmm. I'm lucky to be sort of mentored by Daniel Cohen. He's probably one of the world's experts in force platform technology. So some of the conversations you're part of, and I think that's probably one. I mean, you can invest in a Pasco force platform, test it at 100 hertz, and that'll cost you $5. In a championship club is not a huge strong on the budget. Mm-hmm. So I think, and obviously, even if you use handheld dynos, like you're taking the user out of the equation with a posterior chain test. So it's giving more confidence in your data, and you can collect that in your fit and healthy players, which is then your baseline data that you can then inform based on how they're making progress.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Possibly one last question come in around you talked about explosive distance.
Yeah.
is that something that you've had any reliability or validity on that metric? How have you quantified?
In terms of like explosive distance is related to the metabolic sort of distance placed on the player. So you have high metabolic load distance, which separates distance over 5.5 meters per second squared, which is obviously your high speed running. And then you've got obviously you get your explosive distance, which is calculated from accelerated distance when you change test in terms of distance tests, squares tests, and linear running using a speed gun to show that obviously maximal velocity. What we've noticed that there can be quite high variability with players of explosive distance, because obviously players accelerate and decelerate at different rates because they're different mechanical properties, etc. And obviously, in terms of using that, I've used it to quantify like running load demand in short restricted spaces. Telling you they've done nothing else. So it's telling us in that type, if we're using it for the fit and healthy squad, which I have done for training environment when they're fit. So it's giving me objectivity of what I want to return that player back to.
Great stuff. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate that. And thank you very much for your time and expertise. For those that haven't read any of Matt's work, I would urge you to go towards the literature and have a read of some of his case studies. They're really insightful. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that in our rehab practice. Thanks, Matt.
No worries. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for listening.